I'm Tanner Woodford, founder and executive director of the Design Museum of Chicago. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and foster innovation through design. We believe design has the capacity to fundamentally improve the human condition and strive to make it accessible to everyone through free exhibitions and events like this. Raising Products is made possible due to support from the Terra Foundation for American Art. Thank you to the Terra Foundation. They are dedicated to fostering exploration, understanding, and enjoyment of the visual arts of the United States for national and international audiences. We also want to thank the Stony Island Arts Bank, who was supposed to be the original host for this event before we went virtual, and the South Shore Chamber of Commerce for all of their support of this program. There are 2 more conversations in this series. Join us next Thursday, April 23rd at 6 p.m. for a discussion between Aaron Harkey, who is from the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events for the City of Chicago, and Johans LaCour, who is an entrepreneur, artist, and activist. The following Thursday, April 30th at 6 p.m., we're hosting a discussion between Paula Aguera from Borderless Studio and Obi Nozota from Orange Skin. If you have any questions throughout the run of this event, please type them into the chat at any time. We'll be collecting them and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the event. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers, starting with our moderator, Norman Teague. He's a Chicago-based designer and educator who focuses on projects and pedagogy that address the complexity of urbanism and the culture of communities. He co-founded Black House Studios with Fo Wilson, who's also here tonight. Black House Studios is a socially focused design firm. We're thrilled to have both Norman and Fo here. Also thrilled to have Katherine Darnstadt, who's the founder of Latent Design, a progressive architecture and urbanism firm leveraging civic innovation and social impact to design more equitable spaces and systems. And Zoe Ryan, thrilled to have Zoe here as well, who's the John H. Bryan Chair in Curative Architecture and Design at the Art Institute of Chicago. As a curator and author, her projects focus on exploring the impact of architecture and design on society. We will add a link to a one-sheet in the chat, which includes full bios, information on upcoming events, and ways to give back. So with all that said, thanks for being here, and I'm happy to hand it over to Norman.
Great. Tanner, thank you so much, Design Museum, all the hard work that you've put in with working with me over some time to get this right. Zoe Ryan and Katherine Darnstadt, thank you so much for making time for this. I really appreciate it. And Fo Wilson, my partner in crime, thank you so much for everything that you do and all that you put up with from me. I'm gonna share my screen just a bit and give you guys just a little bit context about Raising Products and what got this whole thing started. Great. Cool. So Raising Products. As a young designer, I worked in design, and I looked for designers of color. And this guy, Paul Revere Williams, was one of the motivators in my moving towards architecture and then eventually into furniture design. The structure behind him is the Theme Building in Los Angeles. He is an early pioneer and architect, one of the first African-American architects to be licensed in Los Angeles. Emily Peelton was someone I found early on as well, who was just an inspiration in thinking of new ways of incorporating design into education and thinking of ways in which we can design with communities and not so much for communities. And so a lot of what we wanted to do with Raising Products was to think of ways to employ, expose, involve, educate, and inspire people into design. I think this came about simply because we saw lots of pop-ups, stores and events that would come and then leave these neighborhoods afterwards with nothing to really inspire or show for. This was just an amazing image and moment that I found, and I thought I would share this. But women in the trades are a really important part of what's happening in design today as well. And so, and then last but not least, of course, my friend and the inspiration to what I think is personally the inspiration to what Instagram is today is the Viewmaster viewer. And so Chuck Harrison, a good friend and mentor to many, has been a real inspiration in the design industry. And another big thing that inspired the thought of raising products was just thinking about the vacancy, thinking about the inconveniences, the lack of industry, and the lack of equity in the communities of colors, to think about how we could utilize these problems to come up with solutions that take care of and incorporate design as an engine. So I'm going to get out of that. And I'm going to stop sharing. And so I'm going to talk about raising products is about exposing the design process. The proposed exhibition, primarily objective, is threefold: to illuminate the design process, provide economically valuable, pragmatic skills to patrons of the South Shore area, and establish a creative outlet that expands the arts and culture outlets in this community. In a nutshell, we were looking to take a series of storefronts along 71st Street that were vacant, utilize them for not just a design exhibition, but also to show off the design process, to really let people see how a pair of gym shoes might be made, which is, you know, an adorned thing today. Gym shoes are doing a whole lot more in design than what they did when we were kids, and really highlight what designers do and the process from beginning to end, be it a woodworker, anyone in that sort of artisanship kind of category. And so our exhibition will not only expose the design process and its relationship to fabrication, economics, marketing, branding, and artisanship, but also start the conversation about the history and the future of Chicago art and design and its relevance to communities of color. The painter could just paint. The potter could just throw pots. The architect could just design buildings, and a sculptor could just sculpt the next amazing piece of brilliance. What I've learned is that Black artists and designers find the need to take their street knowledge with a mix of their institutional learning to do the greater good of uplifting and proving their heart and passion is concerned with the conditions of their community. I think it goes hand in hand. And so that's the sort of the body of what we were trying to do with raising products. And I invited Zoe and Katherine because they are a really great hybrid of what's going on via either battling or convincing the institution that this community-led work and built work is worthy, or just introducing ways in which design can be done that has a community at heart. I feel as if my first question will just be a warmer, and that is, how do we bring art and design closer to second graders in Pilsen, Inglewood, and Roseland neighborhoods? And I'm hoping that I can get some informal conversation that just fills me in on what you guys have been doing. And maybe you can give me in the audience a short intro of some of your work or something that enthuses you.
Yeah, I could definitely start that. I'll try and start with the intro for the audience and try and we'll get back to second graders at
Sure.
the end. We'll try. It will be very circuitous, so
Sounds
we
good.
love nonlinear things here. So again, my name is Katherine Darnstadt. I am, hello, and I'm the founder of Latent Design. And so as Tanner mentioned in the beginning, you know, this is what we have as our byline. We're a progressive architecture and urbanism firm leveraging civic innovation and social impact for more equitable spaces and systems. If we want to make that even shorter, our scope of work and our services are architecture, urbanism, interiors, and other, right? And we all know the other checkbox is the best one to check. And that's where many of the ways that we deliver our design is through this category of other. We live in the other as an individual and also as a firm. And so we look at ways that we have developed as a firm. So since 2010, we're a decade old. Everyone's sharing pictures of being 20 right now, but we're only 10. So we have prototyped new urban design systems to advance urban agriculture, have supported over 100 small businesses through the Boombox program, design maker spaces for design spaces for youth makers, and started to look at education programs that come from those spaces and support them. Supported artist commissions through public spaces, and advanced building innovation and challenged building codes and zoning and licensing to look at ways that we could repurpose vacant spaces or our storefronts, and created new public space frameworks and started to look at ways that we could reclaim our streets and reclaim public space in the variety that it exists in Chicago, because we have this particular notion in Chicago that public space is parks, and we spend all our time there instead of really thinking about public space at the plaza, the block, the sidewalk, the street level. And so when we look at that, we could take what our firm does in terms of architecture, and we distill it really down to, this is what our process is of define, design, deploy. So we want to define the context, design the content, and deploy a new system. And that is really how our work moves forward in the next decade of how we deliver architecture, is through these 3 milestones of our process. And that's how we not only think about this as design justice, but also social and spatial justice.
So maybe I'll do what Katherine is I was going to do. Just tell everyone a little bit about what I do and what we're trying to do at the museum. And then I can, with Katherine, maybe we can talk a little bit more about access for second graders and others. I mean, youth and young adults is what we focus a lot on, and talk a little bit about some of the larger programs at the Art Institute for really encouraging, inclusion and diversity. Before we were rudely interrupted, Norman, I was showing actually a piece of yours that we just recently acquired at the Art Institute, which is the Simmi stool. And I wanted to show this because one of the things that we are committed to, so I'm the curator of architecture and design at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we have galleries on the second floor of the modern wing for modern and contemporary architecture and design. And we've really been trying to diversify our collection, which was when I came 13 years ago, was very regional, obviously very Chicago based, but had really incredible international figures within that collection. We were charged with making it more international, more diverse geographies, obviously narratives, and then adding design when I came, because it was only an architecture collection. So what we've done since is to really dig deep into the collection, but try and install something that I think is quite different than the other departments who have permanent collection galleries at the museum, is to move away from kind of the heroic singular figure, which is often in architecture primarily a male, a white male, and to be much more issue driven. So have a loose chronology running from roughly 1900 to the present, but take you through various issues, like what is architecture design? How does it impact you? So you start with images of the plan of Chicago, and obviously that even your streets and something like a city can be planned, and there's designers and architects behind that. And then we race you all the way up to sort of more speculative contemporary practices. And I talked a lot with Norman about how do we diversify the collection. I was so happy that you showed Charles Harrison's work. I posted the Viewmaster, I think, yesterday on Instagram. He was just such an amazing human being. But he was probably one of the, not the first, but one of the first African-American designers that we really collected his work from. There are others in the collection, but really I've lent on Norman a lot for his advice in terms of how do we build a much more diverse collection. And some of the things that I'm learning is that we need to, the history of design as it's been written is very linear and very closed. So we need to open that up and introduce obviously alternative narratives, alternative figures, but also different types of narratives. So the type of work that we're looking at is also much more interdisciplinary. So as Norman was explaining, the Simmi stool, which is a piece that you can sort of lean up against or sort of perch on, very much inspired by hanging out and perching on a hanging on a car or perching on a wall in the neighborhood streets. Obviously it's a piece that also Norman was drawing references from his own interests. So of course the history of design, but also the history of music, popular culture, and other obviously practices to do with the making of furniture. So I'm really interested how we can obviously start to create a collection and exhibitions that really open up some of these alternative ideas about what makes design history. One of the other things that we've been doing is trying to set the record straight. So introducing really under-recognized figures. We recently did a project about Mexico, 6 artists and designers from Mexico to really talk about the history of modernism in Mexico and how important Mexico was to the history of modern design, something that is very little written about, but also not just singular figures, again, a network of individuals who are all supporting one another. And then our more recent exhibitions, we have a new design series called the Frankie Harrow Design Series, is really looking at different design disciplines and makers, but also asking what is design, because design is furniture, it's products, it's vehicle design, it can be the design of the city, but I'm also really interested in people that are, that research is the basis of their design practice. So we did a show recently with Christine Meindertsma about the research that she does in really heavy industries, like the textile industry or the farming industry, and goes behind the scenes and try and kind of opens up some of these industries through her work. Or upcoming in November is a Turkish collective called Ambiguous Standards Institute, and they are doing a project all about how we produce and construct standards, which of course is very, we're seeing a lot of how standards don't apply to everybody, especially when you think of healthcare, when you think of standards of education, all kinds of things. And then the ambiguities that we have with standards. So that would be an interesting project. So we're trying for diversity in all ways with our collections. I think I'm personally interested. I don't know, how old are you when you're in the 2nd grade?
You're like 7, 8.
You're like 7 or 8. Typically
7, 8,
teens.
yeah.
Typically teens are my kind of my people, because they ask just the most amazing questions. I have a 4-year-old, so now 4-year-olds are definitely my people at this moment.
Unfiltered is what we think about 4-year-olds. They're unfiltered. They'll ask anything.
Sure.
Well, they ask a lot of interesting questions too, but definitely I think because design really is so universal, it really appeals to young people. So you find a lot of people when they're going through the museum, they're not even expecting to see this kind of work at the Art Institute, but once they do, of course, they're fascinated by it, and they decide that that's what they want to, obviously investigate further. So the museum has, an extraordinarily robust and committed educational program, about 70,000 students, and in the last few years has really made a commitment to Chicago youth and teens and families through all manner of kind of collaborations, but also incubating projects within the Art Institute. So young
I got a rich question that kind of relates to teens. But I wanted to hear, first of all, what Zoe might have to say about 2nd grade approaches.
Well, I think this is what I was...
I'm sorry, what Katherine
no,
wants to say.
I was trying to say, I think for us, it's not just about, there are all these we're trying to not just reach out and bring people to the Art Institute. So there's a lot of initiatives to just bus people that might, especially young, kids and young people. Remember, in Chicago public schools, as you all know, I mean, arts education is very, very limited.
Yes.
So the museum over the last few years has had to change its methodology and its approach a lot, because we're realizing we're often the sort of the first place that someone might even encounter, what is art, what is design, what is architecture. And that's very different from learning about it in school and then coming to the museum.
Mm-hmm.
Now you might get to the museum if you are fortunate enough to be bussed in or your family brings you. So we're obviously looking at different ways to bring people in. But I also think it's really important, we have all these partnerships with neighborhood organizations, very young kids with their families, and then also teens that get kind of incubated, especially during the summer months at the Art Institute. So it's, young people writing, maybe being photographers, coming in school groups, but really doing projects for a sustained period of time. And I feel like that, to me, has been one of the most successful ways. And there's a design program as part of this too, and especially from the South Side, from different neighborhoods, the West Side, there are strong focuses. And for me, what I've loved about that is often they'll start to come back. So you build up a rapport which you might not have on a first time visit.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Katherine, did you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I wanted to play off of what was two things that were said earlier. One is this kind of this unfiltered nature of young people, of especially like the younger you go, of questioning, right? So when we think about the design of our spaces, our communities, and even the objects that we hold dear, we don't necessarily think of that as design as a career, but we love well-designed objects. Right. So I think there's a curiosity that exists at that age that we could continue to foster, from like being excited about design, of saying, like, look at your toothbrush. There's 2 different types of plastics, or 3 or 4 now in your toothbrush. And that's a career you could go into. Or look at your shoe that you mentioned earlier, the first time, Norman, of just like thinking about design culture of the clothing that we wear and being excited about that, and showing pathways by just quickly talking about, like, you could do that for your career. You could design shoes for your career. You could like be an engineer and make like dual polymer plastics that go to the moon and also in your mouth. Right. Yeah. So I think we have to find ways that we just insert design in the everyday. And I think the way that becomes very, where it starts to become more natural is when you have young people question you. Because for us, it becomes the opportunity where we could question back and say, like, how would you do it? What's a new invention? What's a better way? And just kind of go with that, because they see things at completely different than us, not only because they see the world at a different height than us, they have a different sense of time. They also have a different sense of history than we do. And especially when it comes to the design of our communities, as you grow older, you hear more no. You hear no, and then you stop questioning things, and then it just becomes what is. And I don't think anyone has the tenacity like a second grader to question why something is no instead of yes. So I think we can maybe take an inspiration from that to kind of push a needle further.
Yeah. No, I think with the unfiltered comes this, a kid also doesn't have a lot of the other things that adults have on their mind, like the light bill and the car note, these things that sit in the back of our heads. But that fresh pair of Jordans that are sitting there is like literally, you're going to tell me that I can learn how to design, build, and sort of walk away with this shoe in my hand? I think there's a huge emphasis around that. Can
I just jump in there?
Yeah.
I also think we shouldn't forget that young people are already designers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, you're an artist, and it gets sort of assigned a different sort of titling when you're older, but they're already inventing things and making things, and it's so inherent in what we do, and solving problems, and I mean, I wish I grew up when I was a second grader, and we had my dad had a pair of Jordans, because Nike Jordans, because it wasn't that way. But I have to say, you know, there was something about, I was encouraged to think about what I was doing as really valid, and that
Sure.
creative practice was valid.
Mhm.
It was, you know, opening up my imagination was valid. Storytelling was valid. I think it starts simple, but these things carry us through. I mean, there's no better time than now that we need imaginative, creative thinking, innovative thinking, that the present situation kind of we find ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk more on that, but I just want to see if I can get one more question before we go to open question and answers. Can we as artists, arts administrators, designers, engineers, and small businesses bring back the very collaboration that built American design industry? If so, how? Just giving us a few ways that you guys might think about. And what do you see as challenges or benefits in the current climate we're in now? Based on Corona is different. I think all of us have a new normal that we have to look forward to. Can we talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's about this is that right now we're seeing how the design industry is shifting and collaborating based on response to COVID-19. And what we're seeing is how a design firm that might, for example, normally use their tabletop 3D printer to make models of bespoke spaces is now making masks and working off a commonly shared digital file that's getting tweaked at Harvard, tweaked in California, tweaked in, you know, France, and then all working together off of that. So we're seeing these very natural collaborations. Like, that is one thing that designers, I think, do expertly, is collaborate and see these needs for where design should exist, and maybe elevate or push aside current work for more immediate, like, this is a need we have right now, we can be of value. And I think what will come from this is what will absolutely be a challenge. It's been a constant conversation within design industry, is what happens during this transition or these cataclysmic moments where you have old guard, you know, maybe trying to continue on a status quo, like waiting for normal to come back. And then another group saying there is no normal, there's something, it's shifted, we're responding to that, and how does that? So there's always that tension that will exist. And I wonder if this becomes another one of those challenge or moments that helps maybe push the design industry further to maybe come to some of those internal debates and resolve them.
Sure. I think it's really important that we are thinking about the now. Like, I think, like, yesterday is really, really different from today. As much as I want to hug you, I want to have this thing in person. It's hard right now. So Zoe, did you want to speak to that at all?
Well, maybe I can just build a little bit on what Katherine said. I think what I'm finding so interesting about the moment, and of course, you know, we're still in the thick of it. And it's still, you know, we're still in the middle of trauma. So, I mean, it's, you know, the extent of what the repercussions will be of this, we just don't know yet. The only thing we know is that we won't be coming out in the same situation that we were in before. So we do have to radically rethink the ways that we're working and thinking about things. And I also think when you talk about the industry, I wonder what that is. You know, that itself is being so radically rethought. I mean, just a quick thought that I had when Katherine was talking was that, you know, what we're seeing with all these kind of initiatives that are being worked out, whether they're emergency initiatives for, you know, respirators or medical supplies, or whether they're, you know, all these online platforms that that we're seeing for sharing, you know, resources, or providing services like, you know, picking up prescriptions for the elderly, or dropping off food for people in need. You know, you start to see so many incredible shared platforms. I think the kind of the DIY, the kind of more bottom-up practices. I'm interested to see how they will inform the so-called industry, which is, you know, supposed to be sort of the thing that drives the sort of the engine of change for potentially the design industry. I think it will be really radically have to rethink itself, because so much of what individuals, including design experts, I really do believe in expertise. I don't believe everybody can be, you know, starts off and can solve all these issues. But I think that people coming together, really from different places, but also in much more loose collective ways, will really, I think, have a major impact on how the design industry kind of evolves. Mm-hmm. And also in hopefully in much more ethical, equitable ways, because we need to be, you know, the industries need to be more accountable. We can't just go back to the status quo. You know, there's all these conversations about if we add something to the world, in the design world, it really needs to make a difference. It needs to matter. Because it's just, you know, the stakes are so high now, ecologically, sustainability wise, socially, politically. So I'm, you know, I think as much as I, you know, of course it's a very, you know, tough moment, I am extremely positive that this is a very, you know, a portal for us to imagine, yeah, alternative ways of doing things and alternative futures.
Yeah, I have a question that really kind of ties into where we are right now in questioning and answering. I'm not sure who the question's from, but looking back on history, ideas of the Bauhaus were formed during the time of world wars. What lessons or references can we find in history about where design can go now with our current trauma? I mean, it's very close to what we're talking about now, but I think there was some really key responses, and I'll talk about one, which is the Bentwood Splint by Ray and Charles Ray Eames. I feel like that was a sheer response to like a need, a problem, and coming up with, well, I think a number of solutions, but how does that tie into the South Side and communities of color? I would like to talk more about that. I don't think that it's a Black problem that we have right now, but I do think that we have a pandemic that I think design is definitely responding to in a myriad of ways. I'm gonna propose one last soft question. It's soft.
And Norman, while you're looking at, can I just respond one quick, like maybe
yeah.
Needle you back about the Bauhaus? So like we saw beautiful things that were inspired by industry and industrialization. The war machine like came out of that, right? So you have this analogy of the brutality becoming beautiful. But then we also, from the Bauhaus in that period of time, these moments of where everyone was looking about how do we create a better future that we want to live in. We almost destroyed ourselves. How do we create this better future? And how the South and the West sides are suffering from it is, there are books and books and books of architects who created mass housing. Yeah. This is going to solve our housing problem. This is going to solve our housing problem. This is how we're going to use industry for that. And some beautiful case study homes came from that. We live in a city of Mies, but it's not solved, right? It's not even close to it. So does the same thing happen now with whether it's COVID or whether it's just the time of how people are starting to utilize new industries and new mass technologies to try and solve the same problems that we're still dealing with? And still, really only some of our communities are dealing with because others are not because of privilege.
Sure.
I mean, I was absolutely there with you, Katherine. I mean, I think the fundamentals are, we also have to remember design always doesn't do good.
Yeah.
Design is often the problem, and it's wasn't it Victor Papanak who said, design is, I don't know whether it was him, maybe it was someone else, who said design is the most dangerous, discipline, because it can do so much bad. And I think, in my work at the Art Institute, I think you're so used to coming to the museum and having this thing where you're going to see the best of the best, nothing like it. Often we show things that aren't the best. They were the worst, or they were game changers because they were the worst, But I think something like the Charles and Ream's leg splint, what was so fascinating about that, it was also the fact that they were already, they were, what I love about them is also they were so opportunistic always. So they were already experimenting with that technology, bending plywood, wanting to do something with it. And along comes this challenge. And of course they can make far many leg splints than they can make plywood chairs. Probably by now we've outstripped that literally with plywood chairs. But they're able to identify an issue and a potential solution. And I think that's what you can bring to the South Side. I think you identify, when we did the Mexico exhibition, it was about designers who were really inspired by the Bauhaus. And they wanted Mexico to be international, and they wanted it to be, industry was soaring in the 40s and 50s, and they, in Mexico City they have one of the largest Bauhausian campuses at UNAM, at the university, one of the largest sort of realized Bauhausian projects. But they also knew that if they didn't bring kind of industry and industrialization together with crafts practices and the kind of rich traditions that they had in Mexico at that moment, it would be a lost opportunity. So it was really, how do you bring the hand together with obviously the machine? And it was very interesting to kind of look through that lens at a place that was very cosmopolitan and international at that time. So I think it's more, when I was at, we have a show up right now, which I hope we will keep up, which is about the Chicago Bauhaus. And one of the things that happened when the Bauhaus came to Chicago was, of course, it was taken up by advertising and commercial, made much more commercial than it was, anywhere else, of course, to the benefit. But it's also a really American story. And I wonder how, I haven't really thought about this before now, but I wonder really how that then plays out now in a place like Chicago, because Norman, maybe you could talk a little bit about, the resources that you see that obviously you're working with in your own projects to really bring a very specific kind of design sensibility and mentality to the kind of work that you're doing with the community.
Yeah, I can speak to that just a bit, but I'm gonna ask you guys one more question. I think what a strong aspiration of mine is that the exposure of design as a career choice. So like Emily Peloton speaks of having design inside of CPS, or really capturing the essence of what design can do at a very early age, so that it's not a new thing and it's not this foreign profession that's made, or as looking at being an artist, like not looking at these options outside of the lens of like making a living. Like I think to create exposure for design at an early age, but also I can't find a design firm on the south side of Chicago as easy as I could find a liquor store, as easy as I could find, Harold's Chicken. And I love Harold's Chicken, so don't but, I feel like design, there are numerous disciplines wrapped in design. Research on the front end, like if we had Black researchers that were thinking more about what our communities can do, if we had designers who were thinking about products in a different way, if we had architects that were thinking about filling the vacancy here, and of course developers, so that business side is extremely important. I'm gonna talk too much, so but I think that there's a huge vacancy that we have here in the South Side, not to mention the West Side, that could really benefit from having a slew of really excited Black designers who understood Black problems to really start to approach that, to really start to create platforms where that could make a difference. Yeah, so I want to ask one last question. And I think I want to take it from Fo. This is from Fran. Hi, Fran. Can you wave at us? Hey, Fran. How can design respond to the many instead of the few or client needs that look at data and I think research? I wasn't so clear of the question. Okay, so how can design respond to the many instead of the few, or clients' needs that look at data? Let's talk about that, Katherine.
Yeah, and I think that's all of the conversations. That question will come up in all three of the Raising Products probably conversations. It's like, what is the definition of client versus community? Like, where are the boundaries of this brief is how I like to think about it in reality, because you could look at it as, here's this box of, I have to satisfy this one person, this one organization's needs, or do I really open this up and look at how this organization structure sits on a site and in a community and those needs, or what it's addressing or not addressing, or even who the organization serves. So it's like, how far can, in some ways, how far can, the scope spread? And we're a firm where we have a tremendous amount of scope creep in our work because of our curiosity and our desire to, find out the core reason behind something in the parameters that we set up for ourselves within the firm. But I think this idea of, how do you design for a brief, or how do you design for a community, or how do you design for a person? It's a tough one. I think everyone here, every designer struggles with that. Even probably, Norman, is like, you have a beautiful object, but how much can that object reach? Looking at the chair that Zoe had up, how transformative can that one piece be, or a leg splint, or a bentwood chair, or even, for us, one building space. Is it about one building space, or the 1,000 students that come through it in a year, and who are we designing for in that?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I've always thought that design and like college level students that are designing, how could we have so much vacancy in a neighborhood or in a community or a portion of a city, and not think that, we're trying to educate people. Can we actually have them build things in these sort of areas that need it, to really get but literally getting on the ground for that research? Think about it. Because I think everybody's afraid of, like, the G word, gentrification cannot be a part of the change, right? Like, it can't. Or can it? Like, what does gentrification look like when it's done by the very people that are there? Is it still called gentrification? Or, I don't know. But I think it offers a lot of questions of, like, how do you separate, like, education and real world when you're trying to prepare a group of young people to be a part of the world? So I think, do we have one more question? I think.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, sorry.
I also think we have to be very careful about talking about data, because where are these data sets coming from?
Exactly.
They're so biased to begin with, that and they're so narrow in their, sort of the market that they're appealing to, or said that they're appealing to, that obviously you're going to end up with, you know, extremely biased outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's almost starting with some of the things that we almost take for granted. Like you'd have to, you know, do we trust this data? Where did it come from? Who is the sort of compiler of the data? Starting from some, you know, really going back. I mean, if you really want to radically rethink things, you have to start with, you know, looking at the very essence of well, I guess the facts, or the fake facts, which everyone likes to talk about. But in the case of, you know, data sets, they're incredibly biased. I mean, in all manner of ways. But also, so many things are designed with a model of society. I was talking to someone today, a design historian, who's writing a book about boobs, basically about breasts, and I was telling her all about the designs for them, basically, and we have a brief history of the breast pump in the galleries right now. Talk about a design for all, or supposed to be for all. And I was telling her about a conference that I went to not that long ago, where there was a speaker telling us about how they design for seat belts and cars, and the crash test dummies that they use are always basically modeled off of an adult white male. And there's never a female. So of course, the amount of people that are dying because you're sitting in a terrible, you know, and they're not, you know, you never think of a seatbelt over a woman. And so what the car industry apparently have done right now is that they're using a small male child as a sit-in for a woman, which is just like, I mean, bonkers. So you have to go back to like the absolute basics sometimes to be like, why? This is so wrong in so many ways. No wonder it has such, you know, such terrible outcomes and repercussions.
Well, see, that's why I think that a huge part, like you're saying, of that research needs to come from within. I realize a lot of the designers that come into a community with their cookie cutter house all ready to go has done research based on some arbitrary fucking number that they pulled up, and it wasn't somebody who lives, you know, right in the midst of that area that collected that data and is analyzing it. I'm not going to stop until you stop me, Tanner. So
just about to stop you. I just was going to thank everybody because this hour has gone by so quickly. We only asked for an hour, so I don't want to overextend. Clearly, we can stay as long as we'd like, but
I'd like to ask that if we can still answer the questions that are off to the sidebar that we didn't get a chance to get to, that we would return some sort of email. And then I'd also like to thank Katherine, Zoe, the Design Museum. You guys are freaking awesome for putting up with me.
Yes.
Thank you.
Pro Wilson, you're used to putting up with me, but I thank you again for allowing this, for supporting this. And then I thank all of you for listening, for supporting, for all that you do within the field or outside. I pray for your families and your health. And I hope that you can join us next week for the next talk. Yeah. Thanks, Katherine. Keep doing the best.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you both.
You're rock stars.
I don't know how to end this, but I really don't want to. Feel free to email me. You all have my email address. And I thank you so much. Can I plug something? Who do I want to plug? I want to plug Black House Studios. Yeah, the Art Institute. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Peace out. Cheers.